are listening to a free version of the Majority Report with Sam Steeder. To support the show and get another 15 minutes of daily program, go to majority.fm, please.
The Majority Report with Sam Cedar.
It's Thursday, August 1st. I'm sorry. 2019, I'm Michael Brooks on a Michael Thursday. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. Wow. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal and the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On today's program, Professor Djene Bajalan, professor of history at Missouri State University. What's happening in Turkey? Erdogan, really the original of the modern oligarch, of the modern autocrat trend. Signs of resistance, signs of breakthrough. Bernie Sanders pushing the dial in foreign policy. Will get a perspective on how the Democrats are talking about the world as well. Debate night last night. Whoo, yeesh, boy, that was depressing. Shaky performances from the two frontrunners, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Points scored by others. We'll get to that. CIA claims it has killed Osama bin Laden's son. A landmark and crucial arms treaty is set to implode as the Pentagon moves aggressively towards testing new weapons systems. That has been in the works for a while. President Rouhani slams the United States over its childish sanctions that they've placed on Iranian Foreign Minister Jawad Zarif. HUD proposes more hurdles to prove housing discrimination. Senator Josh Hawley, we're going to have to figure this guy out. He's on a crusade against big tech. It's not really about breaking up monopolies or making them public goods. It's about actually controlling your behavior.
Making them fash.
Incredibly, incredible. The type of violation of your personal discretion that makes even a good, thorough-growing democratic socialist blush. Of course, we are, in fact, pro-liberty in reality. Fed draws a rebuke from Trump after the rate cut. Arizona sues the Sackler family. Protests across Brazil in solidarity with Glenn Greenwald as clown fascist leader has threatened to throw Greenwald and members of the Intercept Brazil in prison for revealing this extensive corruption of the car wash investigation that made Lula da Silva a political prisoner and helped lead to the rise of fascism in Brazil at the same time that aggressive assaults on the Amazon and indigenous communities are taking place in Brazil. In Colombia, there are movements there for indigenous rights taking place as well. And the Democratic second debate sees a significant ratings decrease. And if you thought Jeffrey Epstein couldn't get any more disturbing, well, of course you didn't think that. And he does get more and more disturbing. All that and more on today's Majority Report. I'll just say, for those who were wondering why I was unable to stop laughing in the beginning, it's because Matt's opening interstitial with sound drop is one of the most unbelievable juxtapositions I've heard in my life. And it's absolutely hilarious. And I basically wish that we could just end the show early and listen to that. Maybe.
Awful nominee. I live in California, a safe state, so I pulled the lever for Jill Stein, not just for myself, but for them and for this country. So I want you to say to me that I was wrong.
So melodramatic, but I'm saying in the audio version, you were playing Fela Kuti with that.
It was the Don
amazing.
Isaac Ezekiel combination. Is
Some good
playing.
Nigerian high life.
You were playing some Nigerian high life music. I thought it was Fela. Oh my God.
The Majority Report, keeping you from crying in your car.
Jesus Christ.
pulling the lever for this country.
Oh my God.
More on that later.
Yeah, speaking of pulling the lever for this country, Joe Biden, he talked about TPP last night. And I just want to say here, it's very important to remember that Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, every single corporate Democrat who has promoted trade deals, which are really simple. They're not free trade deals. They are corporate bureaucracy deals. Particularly TPP was condemned as one of multiple examples, but I'll just focus on this one for the moment. International medical activists, because it would have been a direct threat to generic drugs and readily accessible drugs for underdeveloped countries. That was one area. It would have cost a lot of lives. The investor dispute mechanism is an anti-democratic mechanism that would basically override nation states' ability to legislate environmental labor protections in favor of whatever a corporation demanded, whether it was a bank, pharmaceutical company, tobacco company, tech industry. And every single time a Democrat says that they're proposing a new kind of trade agreement or backing a new kind of trade agreement, Bill Clinton said NAFTA would have unparalleled environmental and labor standards. It did not. It led to a proliferation of sweatshops, environmental pollution. It was actually great for cartel trafficking, was a huge breakthrough in how drugs are moved into this country, and it lost a fair amount of blue-collar jobs. TPP also, and Barack Obama used the exact same rhetoric. So Joe Biden here is pretending, even though he fought his heart out while he was vice president, for TPP, even though it was anti-public health, anti-worker, anti-environment, he's pretending now that he would support something different by resorting to the same rhetoric that Democrats that try to sell these awful deals have always resorted to. Let's take a look from last night.
Vice President Biden, just to be clear, would you or would you not rejoin the TPP, yes or no?
I would not rejoin the TPP as it was initially put forward. I would insist that we renegotiate pieces of that with the Pacific nations that we had in South America and North America so that we could bring them together to hold China accountable for the rules of us setting the rules of the road as to how trade should be conducted. Otherwise, they're going to do exactly what they're doing, fill the vacuum and run the table.
So, again, this means extremely little. As far as it being a counterweight to China, that's the prime way TPP is sold from a geostrategic standpoint. And there's two ways of answering this. One, of course, from a worker, normal person perspective, you are not in competition with China. In fact, there are some very significant overlapping interests between working people in both countries and working people internationally, obviously. Everybody, regardless of conditions, wants to get paid better, have more power over their own work lives. The other dynamic here is that, China and the United States obviously have had for quite some time now a reciprocal relationship where you basically exchange cheap sweatshop labor for incredibly cheap products. That dynamic is changing. I mean, China is now certainly a power in its own right and only going to get more so. That's just reality. I'm a big critic of many aspects of the Chinese model and foreign policy, obviously. And they've also lifted a lot of people out of poverty, and they are going to reassert their role in the world. It's a historic anomaly and oddity that China has not played a more significant role in the past couple of years. That bodes very badly in some areas. It bodes well in others, potentially. So that kind of rhetoric, though, of containing China and getting serious about IP and all of these types of things. First of all, the United States has a reciprocal relationship, obviously, between Silicon Valley and the defense establishment and so on. So that's one thing. So if you want to really deal with China in these more sort of geostrategic questions, there needs to be things like a Geneva Convention on how we deal with technology, how we deal with hacking and drones and all of these other types of issues. But the geostrategic concerns of a very narrow set of interest is antithetical in the TPP to the lived concerns of people who work across Asia, people who need medicine, and everybody who breathes on the planet. This is Joe Biden in 2013, loving TPP.
The Trans-Pacific Partnership is perhaps the most ambitious.
He said the TTP in the last clip, and he can't say it in this clip
I think
either.
the TTP was the European version.
T-tip or something like that?
Yeah, I think so.
know.
I could be wrong,
Right.
but I think he's making some type of mistake like that.
The Trans-Pacific Partnership is perhaps the most ambitious trade negotiation underway in the world. It will break new ground on important issues, from the challenges of state-owned enterprises to ensuring the free flow of data across borders, to enhancing regional supply chains, to ensuring transparency and cutting red tape. We're also working to strengthen protections for labor and the environment. We Americans, we welcome competition. It's stamped into our DNA. It is not a problem. What we're talking about is shaping a new standard that can become the metric by which all future trade agreements are measured. You know that genuine competition pushes our companies and our people.
Stunning that he would say the free flow of information when one of the prime aspects of this is an incredibly restrictive intellectual property regime, which would, if you want, yes, it would. That's what Hollywood wants in terms of bootlegging movies.
That's free trade.
That's right. That's free trade, is making sure that there aren't bootlegs in a market in Shanghai. Sure, whatever. And then, far more seriously, you're talking about IP laws that will protect pharmaceutical companies at the expense of global public health. If you go back to the late 1990s, and the Clinton administration had to reverse themselves on this because Al Gore was getting protested at every single event by activists when he was running for president. The South African government, starting to recognize in the late 90s the scale and scope of the emerging AIDS crisis, wanted to deal with generic drugs as part of their solution. The Clinton administration, at the behest of the pharmaceutical industry, threatened extreme sanctions on South Africa. And that's another great example. I mean, I don't have time, obviously, to get into the controversies around Thabo Mbeki and South Africa and AIDS, but just even consider that element of the story that has been so de-emphasized while there's been these kind of single focus on a particular leader's views of the science, which are wrong views, but that's the bigger context. So you're talking about that type of enforcement for a whole range of drugs across the globe under TPP. It's a fundamentally anti-worker bill, a fundamentally anti-public health bill, and he obviously is not talking about doing anything different. I mean, this is a very Trump move almost. This is just call it something different.
It's going to be great.
It's going to be great. You're going to love it. So, Joe Biden continues his I guess not even devolution, just his stasis.
Mendacity.
His mendacity. The 1985 Democratic Leadership Council energy. And it's not good for you folks. Not good. And also, and I say this as somebody who, again, it's like, I disagreed with Sam. I don't think him saying, don't be too hard on me, kid. I think, frankly, a lot of people find that kind of charming. I don't like... You can't go after him on every single thing when you talk to a broader base of people, but I am becoming increasingly concerned watching him debate that, like, this guy is just absolutely not up for this. Like, on the substance and also on, like, he's not up for this. Like, he's looking very bad up there, and I'm starting to get quite concerned about the idea of the guy being on a stage with Donald Trump. Do you know what the problem keeping so many businesses from knowing their numbers, Brendan?
I don't know.
It's so funny because earlier this morning you said it's their hodgepodge of business systems, and I said you're exactly right. They have one system for accounting, another system for sales, another for inventory, and so on. It's just a big, inefficient mess that takes up too much time and too many resources, and that hurts the bottom line. Introducing NetSuite by Oracle. the business management software that handles every aspect of your business in an easy-to-use cloud platform and gives you the visibility and control you need to grow. NetSuite. You save time, money, and unneeded headaches for managing sales, finance, accounting, order, and HR instantly right from your desktop or phone. That's why NetSuite is the world's #1 cloud business system. And right now, NetSuite is offering you valuable insights with a free guide, 7 key strategies to grow your profits at netsuite.com/majority. That's netsuite.com/majority to download your free guide, 7 key strategies to grow your profits. netsuite.com/majority, link on the homepage. And I'm excited to hear back from folks at Credo. Majority Report's had a long relationship. Do you stand for the rights? Do you stand for women's rights and for the environment? There's a company that stands with you. That's Credo. Credo. Credo is the only phone company in America that supports the same causes you do. Causes fighting to stop climate change and protect reproductive freedom and immigrants' rights. Credo donates $150,000 every month to groups like the Rainforest Action Network, Planned Parenthood, the ACLU, and many more, while other phone companies spend millions to push through mega mergers and fund right-wing politicians. It is so infuriating to read what these other telecoms contribute to and the causes they push. You make choices every day about where you spend your money, so make your mobile phone one of those choices. Switch to Credo Mobile now. As a reward, you'll get 12 pints of Ben & Jerry's ice cream. That's a pint a month for 12 months. You'll get coverage on the nation's largest, most reliable network, along with low rates and a complete selection of smartphones, including the latest models from the top brands. Make the switch today. Go to credo.com/majority or enter offer code majority at checkout. That's credo.com/majority. Link on the website.
Now that's a sweet deal.
It is a sweet deal. I like that. All right, folks, we're going to take a brief break, and we will come back with Djene Bajalan. Welcome back to the Majority Report. Michael Brooks here. Joining us now is Djene Bajalan. He's a professor of history at Missouri State University and a contributor on TMBS. He's written in many different outlets that you can find, and he will be joining us on August 24th at the TMBS live show at Lincoln Hall in Chicago, Illinois. Get your tickets. Djene, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing? Looking forward to Chicago very much.
Me too. I'm doing well, brother. Glad to be talking with you. Getting a little bit of an echo, Djene.
Oh, let me just fix this. Sorry about that.
No
I don't
worries.
know why that happened.
No worries.
Yeah.
So first we're going to get to what's happening in Turkey, and I think in some ways it's actually very illustrative to understand Erdogan and the just really horrible situation that Turkey is in under his leadership. In some ways is really the kind of first iteration of this Trump, Bolsonaro, Modi world, Netanyahu, Putin world. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the Democrats' foreign policy. They don't talk about it much, obviously. People don't typically talk about foreign policy. And then there's, the cliches and repetitions that the press pushes and, is obviously funded by all of the arms manufacturers and all of the, conventional think tanks in D.C. and mostly people kind of repeat the catechism. As you look at this field, what are your sort of takeaways in terms of what's being put forward in terms of foreign policy? And are there any particular bright lights or particular low lights?
Well, I think if we look at I think it's 20, 21 people running at the moment, it seems the majority of the Democratic candidates don't seem to be sort of stepping out the traditional comfort zone of U.S. foreign policy. There's a lot of criticizing Donald Trump for conducting foreign policy by tweet, but that's not, that's a style rather than substance critique. However, we are seeing a kind of break with the traditional sort of view of foreign policy in Bernie Sanders' approach to foreign policy issues at the moment. Breaking the silence on a lot of issues, breaking the consensus in Washington on a lot of issues. Most recently, for example, we saw on Pod Save America, Bernie Sanders, saying, he will hold Israel accountable, especially using the $4 billion that the United States provides to Israel as a kind of leverage. So this is a really interesting sort of approach we're seeing to foreign policy. And we're also seeing Sanders sort of take, move away from sort of the national security focus to taking a more holistic approach to foreign policy. So, and linking that to domestic issues. So we see the refugee crisis at the U.S. border at the moment, and Sanders is linking that to U.S. foreign policy in Central America, the need for a Marshall Plan, and so on and so forth. And he seems to be really sort of taking the lead in providing an outline of kind of progressive foreign policy that we might see. If we look at sort of left-wing politics, in the United States, we often sort of have this problem that, people on the left are very critical of American foreign policy, but don't necessarily come up with an alternative. It's important to critique foreign policy, but, Sanders is a really, it's a possibility that he will become president of the United States. And it is essential that we begin to develop a kind of progressive approach to foreign policy beyond just criticizing sort of the evils of American imperialism. And sort of, as someone from the United Kingdom, I can actually see a parallel between Sanders' approach to foreign policy and Jeremy Corbyn's approach to foreign policy, particularly with regard to sort of critiquing Saudi Arabia, calling into question the relationship with Saudi Arabia, and sort of moving beyond sort of, the silence that we often see on the relationship with Saudi Arabia. After all, if you go back to 9/11, it wasn't Afghans that attacked America; it was Saudi citizens. So, critiquing Saudi Arabia is extremely important and hasn't been done enough in mainstream politics. So he's really taking a lead on this, and I think that is sort of dragging along other people who are trying to fill that progressive lane in the primary process. So you're beginning to see Elizabeth Warren, who has, traditionally, she hasn't been particularly outstanding on foreign policy, beginning to adopt some of that language that Bernie Sanders has been adopting with regards to foreign policy. You see Tulsi Gabbard trying to present as a kind of leading anti-war person, someone who's going to sort of take a new approach to foreign policy, although one might question how sincere Gabbard's approach is to foreign policy.
Well, and I think certainly one might question Warren's as well. Do you think, though, that when we sort of break out, and I think, you could touch on maybe this, the Biden lane as well, or in the Buttigieg lane of no change, and really why it's a problem that, this, I won't do it by tweet kind of bare minimum of, not being Trump is particularly pronounced in what Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg have put forward. But staying in the Sanders-Warren Gabbard lane, just to emphasize a couple things. Now, obviously, you can identify, people, look, Bernie's cast votes on foreign policy I disagree with. I think several years ago he was way less brave and less willing than he is now to speak forthrightly on the occupation and the just rank, bigotry and authoritarianism of the Netanyahu government. But that being said, and I want to, take this in three, Bernie Sanders can point back to the 80s, and obviously people like, New York Times reporters who don't care about, anybody in Nicaragua and don't have a basic grasp of U.S. history. They can try to turn this into a bad thing, but the reality is that going back to the 80s as a mayor, he was practicing citizen diplomacy. He was strongly criticizing the Reagan administration's support for death squads and juntas and genocide even in Latin America. He was also talking quite eloquently about how the World Bank and IMF works for Western financial institutions, right? So on. In the Warren, and so there is this through line, and obviously, of course, I would mention the fact that he's the only candidate to call for freeing Lula da Silva as an example. So that, even though Julian Castro has also echoed some of the same rhetoric about Central America, there's infinitely more credibility and history in the Sanders case. In Warren's case, and Mehdi Hassan made this point recently, we know that her foreign policy up until very recently has just been, very conventional, even to the right? She's voted for extreme military increases. She's defended even Israel's, truly brutal killing of civilians in Gaza in 2014. That was so brutal that even Joe Scarborough called it out. And now, yes, there's been some slight following Sanders. There's been some slight change in rhetoric, but Hassan kind of pointed out, but what about on a staffing level, right? I mean, Elizabeth, if you don't have any indication that this is something that a candidate really cares about and thinks about, and that actually foreign policy is something that a president has the most autonomy and power over, which is a problem in and of itself, but that's the way things are, that having somebody who basically will probably go back to convention is a big problem, just even on a kind of staffing and intellectual assumption level. And then in Gabbard's case, look, I think on one level, it's fair to say, okay, people in Venezuela don't care about the philosophical intricacies of somebody. They just want to know that you oppose a coup, and fair enough, and credit to her for doing that. But when you say sincerity, I'm assuming you're talking about things like drones. You're talking about things like, look, the Assad meeting, there's no doubt that it's being used by people like Kamala Harris in a profoundly insincere and smearing way. But that being said, there is a difference between opposing military action in Syria and being willing to meet with Assad, which I don't have an objection to, versus maybe the trip was questionable in how it was conducted. Maybe you want to do diplomacy with Assad, but you still acknowledge that obviously Assad has slaughtered hundreds of thousands of people. And part of diplomacy is you work with people who have blood on their hands. So that's maybe why there's some questions. So I guess in three parts, Sanders' history going in terms of citizen diplomacy and more credibility, Warren's problem in terms of kind of staffing and ideological assumptions, and then what really the Gabbard contradiction is here.
Yeah, I mean, to begin with, on sort of credibility and plausibility, Sanders has this long record. And again, to make the comparison with the United Kingdom, one of the reasons people trust Jeremy Corbyn, or at least some, many on the left trust Jeremy Corbyn, is because he has a long record of opposing authoritarian regimes around the world, which sort of gives him, and as well as someone like Sanders, these people, they have this kind of consistent record. I mean, no one is ever going to have 100% foreign policy agreement with anyone else, and no politician is going to be able to cover every single issue in the world. For example, a lot of the criticism that Corbyn gets regarding Israel, and I believe that Sanders would get regarding Israel if he wasn't Jewish, is that, you're obsessed with it. I mean, at some point possibly. But it's more difficult to attack Sanders on that issue. But one of the reasons Corbyn, I don't find the argument that Corbyn is obsessed with Israel plausible is because Corbyn was dealing with issues around the world, including the Kurdish issue, including issues in Latin America, including South Africa for a long time. And Sanders has that same pedigree of sort of, like you say, citizen diplomacy and being involved in fighting against authoritarian regimes in different parts of the world. So that is very different from Elizabeth Warren, who, I mean, if we draw a parallel, let's say, with sort of the domestic agenda, Sanders has taken the lead on Medicare for all, and now people are following him. And I think when it comes to foreign policy, this is, Warren has moved towards Medicare for all after being sort of skeptical of it, and now she's moving towards this more progressive kind of foreign policy. Now, of course, there are aspects of Warren's foreign policy which I think are, connected to her broader political outlook on the world, such as her attitudes towards trade deals and things like that. But when it comes to issues of American intervention around the world, she doesn't have this long pedigree. And I'm not an expert on staffing issues with the Warren campaign, but I would conceive that the kind of people she would select for an administration wouldn't be too far out. They would perhaps be the left wing of the foreign policy establishment in Washington, which of course is better, I suppose, than having these far-right ideologues in office. But then again, it's not going to be a radical break. With Sanders, we have interesting people like Matt Duss working for his foreign working in his campaign. So I think there is a possibility that you can have a real break from the traditional foreign policy. As you say, the presidency is, in many ways, primarily a foreign policy position. And I think, on a personal level, and this is my personal preference, I think Sanders' pitch that he's going to change foreign policy is more plausible than other sort of individuals attempting to sort of present an alternative to foreign policy. Now, when it comes to Tulsi Gabbard, I think on one hand, I work in the Middle East studies field, and she is not a popular person amongst people who study the Middle East.
Right.
She's a lot of people don't forgive her for sort of perhaps not working with is a little bit too strong, but kind of giving time to sort of anti-Muslim figures, being close with certain fascistic elements amongst the Arab nationalist movement.
Voting against refugees, yeah.
Voting against refugees, that's another sort of black mark against it. There's a kind of weird Tulsi Gabbard cult where people are kind of trying to present her as a peacenik, but as far as I know, she has, she receives contributions from the arms industry as well.
Not anymore, but she had it in the past. Yeah, she has in the past.
So, but at the same time, when people go after her like that, well, Kamala Harris has been very uncritical of Israel. I'm not, comparing Israel's to Assad regime, obviously. But, we can criticize a lot of people for their very, problematic foreign policy.
No, that's actually I want to underline that. I mean, because again, frankly, look, of course you can't at this point, all of the atrocities committed by every single, from U.S. to Russian to Assad to, Saudi faction, of course, because it's a civil war. But I mean, look, let's really underline. I mean, Israel's an apartheid state. We can't soft pedal that. And Kamala Harris and Cory Booker and Joe Biden absolutely uncritically support one of the greatest travesties and abuses in the world. And look, I always get, the Tulsi cult definitely hates me to the extent it exists, but that is a major double standard. I will add, by the way, Tulsi's also I don't trust her on Israel or Iran either, frankly. She went to the Netanyahu speech that even Tim Kaine boycotted. But that's a great point. I mean, if Kamala Harris and so on is going to uncritically support a never-ending occupation and siege, there's no grounds upon which for her to just use this Assad meeting as an ever-ready demonization of Gabbard, particularly, by the way, when Gabbard makes very important points about, as an example, Harris's atrocious, prosecutorial record.
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue comes where does the criticism come from? Because, there are very legitimate criticisms of Tulsi Gabbard, but some of the people levying those criticisms don't really have the strongest position to criticize from. I think that's a really important sort of point that we always have to make. And I think, Gabbard does have these certain right-wing impulses on certain issues. I mean, again, I'm not an expert on Hawaiian politics, but one of my colleagues here in Missouri State, who is from Hawaii, made the point that, Hawaii is basically a one-party democratic state. So, people in Hawaii regard her as being kind of quasi-Republican in some ways. I mean, I don't know if that's entirely fair, but she's certainly not as progressive, as people people often make out. I mean, I remember looking up her voting record to check this. And again, people should probably fact check this, but it was not significantly different from Seth Moulton's voting record. But, there aren't people going around, going crazy for Seth Moulton. I mean, I don't know if he's...
I'm sorry, I don't know who Seth Moulton is, and I refuse to learn. And then just briefly, because we'll get to Turkey in a minute, but just... Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg, then we have, and Cory Booker, I think, utterly disqualified himself by not committing to rejoining the Iran deal. When you look at that, right-wing conventional lane, again, we have to just set aside the idea that it will be minimally better than Trump. I mean, how disturbing is it that there's still such a broad consensus to not have any kind of really radical shift on military presence, on ecological policy, on things like TPP? I mean, what do you make of just how conventional that lane is spanning Biden to Harris?
I mean, it's pretty depressing and It's pretty unexpected. I mean, the foreign policy establishment in D.C. is well funded. There are a lot of entrenched interests, whether we're talking about international lobbying groups, arms industry, and so on and so forth. So, the fact that you still have that conventional lane is unsurprising. But what I think is kind of significant is that compared to, 15, 20 years ago, it seems so much more out of touch with the mood in the United States. I mean, 20 years ago, of course, you had, opposition to the Iraq war. Well, you had opposition to the Iraq war. You had a huge mobilization. But the right wing in the United States was also was very gung-ho about foreign intervention. I don't think that's the case anymore. And I think one of the reasons Trump was successful, or, maybe one of the auxiliary reasons, was that, he was, rightly or wrongly, he was perceived by many people as being, far less of a war hawk than Hillary Clinton, who was associated with all these failed foreign policy adventures in the past. Of course, people often kind of ignore the fact that, the war on terrorism was backed up by many members of the Democratic Party.
Absolutely.
I think one of the reasons Obama did so well in the primaries was that he was one of the few people who had voted against the Iraq war.
Well, he
So we
opposed
have-
it. He wasn't even in the Senate, but he opposed it.
Yeah, well, he was opposed to the Iraq War. My mistake. But he was, he was against it, and there were, that's something else Sanders was against. But they were very much out on the margins of politics. You had people like Joe Biden who were supporting the Iraq War. In fact, one of the reasons I knew about Joe Biden before I came to the United States and before he became vice president was because he made a lot of comments on the Iraq War. He's one of his foreign policy advisors was a Kurdish lady, and so that was a big deal amongst the Kurdish community. And he was proposing breaking up Iraq into 3 different sort of regions to kind of deal with the problem. So I think we live in a different time. People are tired of the war, and that's not just people on the left, but it's also people who are perhaps in the political center or lean right. And I think that's and so sort of kind of where you have people talking about continuing the presence in Afghanistan and continuing these wars. I don't think it resonates with anyone, and I don't think
What do
I
you
don't
make
think
of the
it's a big
fact?
constituency.
What do you make of the fact? And last question. I know we still have to get to Turkey for a little bit, but what do you make of the fact that they still will talk about the amount of troops lost and so on, which was incredibly important, obviously. And then at the same time, if you totalize the war on terror, we've killed millions of civilians spanning activity across the globe. If you just look at what we've done under the authorization of the AUMF, which is, of course, another thing that still hasn't been reformed since 2001, why is it so difficult for these candidates, especially with news coming out of Afghanistan and another sort of incredible increase in civilian casualties, for them to just even acknowledge all of the innocent people abroad that our military action has taken, from Afghanistan to Yemen to Pakistan to Syria to Iraq, obviously, but even also in the Horn of Africa? It's really disturbing.
I mean, I think it's a political calculation. Rightly or wrongly, I think they don't think talking about sort of the cost to the people who live in those countries in which American intervention has taken place. I don't think that's going to play. I think they think that that's not going to play well amongst the American public, and that's going to open them up to criticisms of being sort of unpatriotic and sort of anti-American. I mean, whether that's correct or not, I don't know. I mean, on an anecdotal level, I'll give you an anecdote. One of the people I know here in Springfield, he's like a hardcore conservative supporter of John Ashcroft, funds the Republican Party. But, one of the issues he brings up about the Iraq War is like, we killed so many people in that war. He'd been someone who'd been very gung-ho about U.S. intervention, and now someone who is a lot more reticent about it. So I don't know how, I don't know, I think this is a political calculation, but I don't know how wise a political calculation it is.
I agree, and I think that even we need to start adjusting our discourse to not using synonyms for killing civilians, waging war, and so on. In Turkey, there have been a couple of different elections in not the capital, but the main city, Istanbul. The capital is Ankara, of course, good old Ankara. What happened in these local elections, Djene?
Yeah, sure. So Turkey, the news in Turkey has, I think, been overshadowed by a lot of things in domestic politics and, of course, in foreign relations. We've had this crisis with Iran in recent months. And so sort of Turkey has flown a little bit under the radar, but a lot of things have happened. So in March, we had local elections across Turkey, which was seen by many people as a referendum on Erdogan's continued rule in the country. And what we had was significant gains for the opposition. Nowhere near sort of a major sort of overturn of the AKP, but some really important symbolic victories. We had an opposition candidate winning in Ankara, and we had an opposition candidate winning in Istanbul. And Istanbul is extremely important because it accounts for about 30% of Turkey's GDP. And from the AKP's perspective, it is a huge sort of engine of political patronage. You get contracts in Istanbul and you are set up for life. it's a vast city. You've seen the city, you've been to Istanbul, so you kind of know how massive that city is. So this is a really important base for AKP, who've controlled it for a long, long time.
Just to be clear, that's Erdogan's political party. Yeah.
Yes, the Justice and Development Party, which has governed Turkey since 2002. So these were really important sort of victories for the opposition. Now, these elections took place in March, and what we saw was sort of challenges to the legitimacy of these elections. Now, a lot of the news focused on the Istanbul election, of course, which was very close between the government candidate and the opposition candidate, Ekrem İmamoğlu. This sort of, we're talking about 48%, point something to 48%, and the AKP took the opportunity to kind of challenge the results, accuse sort of the opposition of some kind of vote rigging, which was a kind of bizarre accusation, and eventually force a rerun. Now, this was not the only place in Turkey where the results of elections were overturned. I would note across Turkish Kurdistan, you also had the AKP overturning electoral results and basically imposing government candidates on those local governments. But what's interesting here, we also had a similar process taking place in the west of Turkey, in the predominantly Turkish populated regions of Turkey, which is sort of is a kind of new phenomenon. So basically, in Istanbul, the government forced a sort of rerun of that election a couple of months later in June, and it's been a pretty heavy and vicious campaign. So, for example, the opposition candidate, who is originally from the Black Sea region of Turkey in the northeast of the country, was accused of being a crypto Greek, which is a kind of blood libel accusation in Turkish politics. In the first round of the election, Erdogan was campaigning for his mayoral candidate, Yildirim, who was the former prime minister, and using footage from the Christchurch massacre to sort of mobilize Muslim support behind the opposition. So it's been a really divisive campaign. Very much like the kind of Trump campaign. You have sort of a political problem. So
is there
try
a way,
and mobilize.
Is that a good way of understanding? I mean, Erdogan's gone through so many different phases, and when I studied in Turkey, there was actually at the time, it was pretty conventional notion that he was like, I mean, if you were on the left, obviously you wouldn't like him because he's a right-wing, pro-capital, very capitalist, religious conservative. And then at the same time, there was this notion that this is just like Islamic George W. Bush, and actually he's democratizing some institutions and so on. He clearly is an arch authoritarian, and he's an authoritarian in some ways that obviously just echoes Turkish authoritarianism. In some ways, there's nothing new under the sun, right, in terms of previous leaders, although he's escalated and enhanced things. And I want to know, do you see Erdogan as in some ways a precursor to this global rise of alt-right, neo-fascistic governance? Of course, there's all these distinctions, but we can look at a world, obviously, Duterte, Netanyahu, Trump, Bolsonaro, Modi, Orban. Is Erdogan actually like the trendsetter, and the only reason that maybe he's not as tight with the rest of them as he could be is because they hate Muslims, and he Islam is the vehicle for his alt-right politics?
I mean, I think what makes Erdogan a particularly interesting character is that he's a character who has evolved, and his party has evolved. When the AKP, first came into office, it was a genuine political party with factions and groups within it, and so on and so forth. But over the years, as Erdogan has kind of sort of evolved, has sort of enhanced his grip on the party. So the first wave of AKP MPs members of parliament were sort of eventually removed and replaced with loyalists. So we've had this kind of bureaucratic takeover of the AKP. over time. And Erdogan has kind of moved with the times, and especially as sort of the Turkish economy has become sort of less shiny, let's say, and there's been growing economic problems in the country, he has very much moved towards this extremely potent sort of form of identity politics, attempting to kind of like, rather than trying to expand his base of support, but basically trying to, strengthen and consolidate his base. There was a point in the 2000s, in the noughties, where, Erdogan was attracting the support of, Turkish liberals, right? People who, may not, like you said, may not have liked everything Erdogan did, but appreciated the push towards democratization. And what we've seen is Erdogan has transformed himself into a more authoritarian, dictatorial person. So in some ways we can make a comparison with Trump, we can make a comparison with Duterte, we can make a comparison with Netanyahu, and so on and so forth. But he's also, has his own specific dynamic in that he kind of moved away from being a democratizer to being a strongman over the course of his nearly 2 decades in power, which is a kind of an interesting evolution that we've seen. So he is, I would say, definitely very much a prototype of this politician, but he is also sort of his own beast as well.
Absolutely. I mean, in a lot more formidable in some ways, I would say. Is he weaker, though, as a result of these elections?
That is a very good question. I mean, one reads things and people are always sort of predicting the demise of Erdogan, but he still seems pretty much ensconced in power. I mean, we had this rerun of the election, the local government election in Istanbul, and the government candidate was beaten, from by a significant margin. The opposition went up from 48% of the vote to about 54% of the vote. So, there was that sort of symbolic victory. But sort of in the second round of the election, Erdogan kind of sort of stepped back. Now, there was some criticism from sort of influential members of his party about forcing this rerun, but Abdullah Gül, the former president, Ahmet Davutoglu, who was the former prime minister, sort of expressed their discomfort with the forcing of this rerun in Istanbul. But at the end of the day, despite this victory for the opposition, Erdogan still seems pretty powerful in his position. In his position as president, it doesn't look like there's anyone able to challenge him. If you look at the total percentages of the vote in Turkey, Istanbul is a big loss, but the AKP still maintains about 42, 43% of the national vote, much more than any of the opposition parties. And if you sort of add on to that the electoral allies, the National Action Party, the MHP, Erdogan and his allies still have a commanding position on Turkish politics. So, and since the electoral victory of the opposition in Istanbul, there have been some sort of positive developments. For example, there was this petition signed by academics, where thousands of academics called on the government to resume the peace process with the Kurds. And these academics have been purged from their jobs, and they've been sort of ostracized from society. Many have fled the country. If you go to an academic conference on Middle Eastern studies these days in the United States, you'll meet a lot of Turkish academics who are kind of made homeless by this.
Right.
The Turkish Supreme Court has ruled that perhaps some of the rights of these academics were trampled on. But on the flip side, when the opposition won its victory in the local elections, we had the classic maneuver whereby the mayoral position was stripped of some of its powers. So
so AKP, yes. So they're definitely Turkey's Republican Party, just like the moves you see in North Carolina or Wisconsin. So, as a final question, I actually do want to touch on that. The Kurdish dimension a little bit more. We've talked a lot about the HDP, which was an incredible breakthrough and innovation in Turkish politics. It was a party that was centered on rights for the Kurds, but then actually evolved into a broad social democratic civil rights party. It was connected with the social movement, the ecological movement of the Gezi Park protests in 2014. HDP's leaders have been made political prisoners by the Erdogan government. And I'm just wondering if you could touch on the situation briefly of the political prisoners before we go.
Yes, so recently there was a ruling from the European Court of Human Rights, which has sort of condemned Demirtaş's imprisonment. And, you know, the HDP continues to be a political force in Turkey, but of course it's extremely difficult. As I mentioned, you know, at the outset, you've had a lot of focus on the Istanbul election, but not so much focus on the purge of Kurdish local government officials in the southeast of Turkey, in the predominantly Kurdish area. And, you know, at the same time, Erdogan has been ramping up sort of anti-Kurdish rhetoric, you know, from a position, 5-10 years ago, where, you know, Erdogan was trying to reach out politically to the Kurds, entering in negotiations with the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the main insurgent group inside Turkey's borders. It's kind of conducted a volte-face on that, and now we sort of have Erdogan constantly sort of warning against the threat of the PKK. We have sort of a ramping up of violence. We have Operation Claw taking place at the moment, attacking PKK bases in Kandil, which is located in northern Iraq. And the civilian cost of this is quite heavy. A number of villages and civilians have been killed. We have the ramping up of tensions with the Kurds in Syria, constant threats to launch. I mean, as you may be aware, Turkey occupied the Syrian Kurdish-controlled town of Afrin, and now they're threatening to attack Kurdish-held territories east of the Euphrates River, which are territories where the United States has a military presence. So there's basically a ramping up of tensions with the Kurdish community, both internally and externally. This is playing to the nationalist base. As I mentioned, Erdogan has made a political alliance with the National Action Party, which is a far-right fascistic organization in Turkey. So, you know, trying to win that nationalist vote in Turkey means sort of ramping up tensions with the Kurds. Although we did have a very weird spectacle during the election, during the Istanbul election. Istanbul is a very large, has a very large Kurdish community. People often call it the largest Kurdish city. And so the Kurdish voters were extremely important in that vote. You know, HDP members and pro-Kurdish MPs have been elected from Istanbul before. And so in order to win over the Kurdish vote, the AKP and the pro-government press published a letter from Abdullah Öcalan, the jailed leader of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, calling on the Kurds to remain neutral in the upcoming election, which is completely crazy because, so many HDP members have been accused of sort of spreading terrorist propaganda. And then you have the government publishing a letter within the context of an election from what they regard as the leader of the largest terrorist organization in Turkey. And the interesting result is that this letter didn't work. And sort of Kurdish voters sort of continue to support the opposition candidate, much in line with the policy that the HDP was following. So it kind of reveals some interesting fissures inside the Kurdish movement, sort of the decline of Öcalan's, at least his direct political influence, if not his, although perhaps not his symbolic importance to the Kurdish movement, and the continued importance of Demirtaş, who basically embraced the position of allying with the opposition to sort of give a defeat to the Turkish government.
Djene Bajalan, I appreciate your time as always. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me. You take care of yourself, Michael.
All right. Thanks, brother. Talk to you soon. Come see us in Chicago, folks. All right, everybody. Become a member of the Majority Report today. Or I should say, before that, did you know that your phone can be a powerful force for change? With Credo Mobile, it can, because Credo donates $150,000 every month to groups like Friends of the Earth, the ACLU, and Planned Parenthood. Switch to Credo Mobile, the carrier that stands for women's rights, the environment, social justice, and so much more. Learn more at credo.com/majority. That's credo.com/majority. Folks, become a member of the Majority Report today, majority.fm/become a member. That's how all this happens. That's how we stay independent and give you that real depth and content.
This is how we are able to hack Twitch and be able to stay up the entire night despite everybody else going down to the man.
That was a...
Sorry, folks.
Sorry, it was a victory. Total
Last
victory.
man standing.
Last man standing. And it was great. On Tuesday's Michael Brooks show, had on Brooke Thomas and Celso Amorim, former Brazilian foreign minister. This Sunday, Elaine Koo on an illicit history of Hong Kong. The protest... Excuse me. I don't know why I keep dyslexic of me, which I do have, by the way. Elaine Yu of the AFP, French press agency, talking about the history of the Hong Kong movement and where we are today. That's for patrons, patreon.com/TMBS. And go to the Michael Brooks Show YouTube channel. It is a fully humming, fully functioning machine now at well over 60,000 subscribers, over 61,000 subscribers. Help us get to 100,000 soon. And, of course, become a patron. Matt.
Literary Hangover. Folks, you want to check out the Pioneers episode of James Fenimore Cooper. It's really interesting. Also, I'm building my gaming rig currently.
Ooh, snap.
Connected the power cables late last night. So go over to YouTube's the YouTube channel Literary Hangover, because that's probably where I'm going to start before I go on Twitch. So check that out, folks.
Check out the Antifada. We will be right back after a brief break.
You are in for it.
All right, folks, 646-257-3920. See you in the fun.
Are you ready?
Who sent us this?
Anarchy. Alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just as delicious as you can imagine.
The alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just want to degrade the white man.
Alpha males are back.
I take all of it in my throat.
Alpha males are back.
Almost says what?
The alpha males are back.
You are a madman.
And the alpha males are back.
I am a total cunt.
Can we bring back DJ Danerky's song, please?
Yeah, or a couple of them. Just put them in rotation.
DJ Danerky.
Well, the problem with those is they're like 45 seconds long, so I don't know if they're enough of a break for people.
That's fucking nonsense.
Hey, folks, reminder.
I do not have Parkinson's.
And the alpha males are...
Psych. Fuck 'em.
Almost says what?
Almost
says what?
Hell of a lot of bank. Hell of a lot of bank. Hell of a lot of bank. Hell of a lot of bank. Hell of a lot of bank.
All lives matter. Have you tried doing an impression on a college campus?
I think that there's no reason why reasonable people across the divide can't all agree with this. Psych.
And the alpha males are back. And the Africans are black African. And the alpha males are back. And the Africans are black.
See Donald Trump out there, doesn't a little part of you think that America deserves to be taken over by jihadists? Keep it at 100. Can't knock the hustle. Come on. Fuck 'em. Things I do for the bigger game plan. By the way, it's my birthday. Happy birthday to me, Jew boy.
thought experiment for you.
And the alpha males are back. Africans are black. Alpha males are back. Africans are black.
Come on. Come on. Someone needs to pay the price for blasphemy around here.
I am a total pussy.